This is the instructor's overview for Chapter 18, The Gilded Age, from 1865 to 1900. Now, the Gilded Age was a term that was coined by Mark Twain. And something that is gilded is something that's made of a really cheap material, and then it's covered in a thin layer of gold. So when you first look at this object, from the surface it looks all shiny and expensive and fancy. But if you scratch away a little bit at the surface underneath, you see what it really truly is, which is something fairly cheap. And Mark Twain used this to describe the United States during this time, in part because of the very wealthy upper crust of Americans who were getting covered so extensively in the media, and they're engaging in conspicuous consumption, and they're showing off their wealth. So on the surface, it really looked like America was glossy and shiny and rich, but under that surface was poverty. Also from the surface, America looked to be a truly democratically engaged country. People were voting, and there were political speeches. They were voting in higher numbers than they vote today, much higher numbers. And there were political picnics and parades, and it seemed that we were a really engaged political nation, but underneath all that, the nation was deeply corrupt politically. This is the most politically corrupt time in American history. So the chapter begins with a discussion of urbanization. Urbanization is the growth of cities. New cities were being founded, small cities were growing, big cities were getting bigger. The populations in cities doubled during this time, and by 1920, over half of Americans lived in cities. So it's in this time period that the nation quickly transitions from being a country of farmers who live in the countryside into a nation of urban dwellers, people who live in cities. So physically, the cities are expanding out. They're becoming bigger, partly because of mass transit. Can get people out to the edges and then back into the middle to work. But also, we had developed the technology to allow cities to expand up as well as out. So new things like steel frames for high rises, elevators that could get you up and down, and the electricity to run the elevator made high rises like this one possible. This is what downtown Los Angeles looked like in 1905. And you can see some of the public transit down here. This is the Pacific Electric that drove all around Los Angeles. Urbanization led to enormous overcrowding. The city services and the physical infrastructure of the city simply couldn't keep up with all of the people coming in. So the cities are becoming increasingly dirty, crowded places. And in an upcoming chapter, we're going to watch the progressive reformers try to clean up these very messy places. Immigration also escalated during this time, and the textbook talks about this population of what is called new immigrants. They're called new immigrants because the majority of immigrants coming in during this time period were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. These were places that had not sent large numbers of immigrants to the United States before. Most of our immigrants had come from Northern and Western European nations like England, Ireland, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries. So if you look at this chart, you can see the dotted line are immigrants from Northern and Western European nations. These were countries that the United States was accustomed to seeing immigrants come from. They were used to having the Irish come. They were used to having Scandinavians, like Swedish people and Norwegians, head out to places like Minnesota to found farms. And the nation had become comfortable with those populations. Now, the solid line shows the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming in. And you can see it really takes off in 1895. And they were coming from places like Russia, Italy, Poland, Greece, and they were coming in with new religions. So prior to this, most of the immigrants coming in were Protestant. These new immigrants were mostly Catholic, Jewish, and some are Greek Orthodox as well. So they're bringing new languages, new religions, new ways of dressing, new food, new cultures, and it's a shock to many Americans. The immigrants were settling in what were called ethnic enclaves, meaning that they're settling in neighborhoods that were dominated by one or sometimes two ethnic groups. So you can see in this map of Milwaukee, the gray area is the industrial zones, and those are following the rivers in Milwaukee. Factories used rivers to kind of throw their trash in and for transportation. And the workers were predominantly immigrants. The immigrants who came into the United States were mostly taking unskilled jobs, and the textbook talks all about this. And you can see how, for instance, Italians are settling towards the southern portion of Milwaukee in that little green area. Polish people are next to them, and you can see how everybody has divided themselves out. These ethnic enclaves were enormously crowded. This is Hester Street in New York City, and people are just stream into the streets because their apartments are so small and dirty and crowded and hot. So they spend most of their time out here on the street. The American response to immigrants was mixed. Businesses embraced immigrants as a labor force, the more the merrier because it lowered wages. But many other Americans felt threatened by immigrants. They were worried that immigrants would change the nature of America. In fact, though, immigrants, it's really fair to say that at this time period, immigrants literally built America. They helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Italian immigrants built it from the east. Chinese immigrants worked on it from the west. Immigrants built the high-rises in the cities. They built the Brooklyn Bridge. They're really doing the bulk of physically building these cities, and they're doing the bulk of the work in the factories, which were the engine that were driving the American economy. Nevertheless, Americans were fearful of this group, and in this political cartoon you can see the artist has presented immigrants as part of this tide that is pushing Uncle Sam up against a cliff, and they're presenting a danger to American ideas and institutions. And the title here at the bottom is The High Tide of Immigration, a National Menace. So they did not, this artist and many Americans didn't perceive the reality of this situation, which was that immigrants were a really vital workforce when the nation needed one. They see them as this danger. So if we focus in on the left bottom portion of the picture and on the subtitle, the subtitle says, immigration statistics for the past year show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants are now being supplanted by criminals and outlaws of all Europe. So anti-immigrant proponents began to say, well, it's not workers they're sending all these criminals. And to help us out, the artist has written on the hats of the immigrants here what he thinks of them. They're illiterate, they're criminal, they're anarchists, they're paupers, they're degenerates, mafia. At the same time that these cities were embracing large numbers of immigrants, local politics were changing. Americans were engaged in politics during this time period. As I mentioned before, they were voting in much higher numbers, and most of the political excitement revolved around local politics. So in our contemporary America, we tend to be most engaged with federal politics, with national politics. But at this time period, people really cared about who their representative was on city government, who was their alderman, who was their mayor. People were almost more excited about that than who the president was. In the cities, the textbook describes the emergence of political machines. These were corrupt political organizations on the local level. And here you can see a cartoonist who has drawn a picture of Boss Tweed, who was the head of the political machine in New York City. And the artist has presented him as a puppeteer. He's controlling everybody in the city. And they did this through corrupt means. They stuffed ballot boxes. They simply lied about election returns. They bribed people to vote. There was not a secret ballot, so everybody knew how you voted when you walked into the polling place. So sometimes people from the political machine would stand outside the polling place and voters would just sell their votes. They'd say, how much you want for my vote? And the going rate was about $8 to $12 for someone's vote. So these political machines also profiteered off of real estate. They simply stole money from the city. They're enormously corrupt. On the other hand, they relied on their immigrant voters. So they were responsive to immigrant voters. One of the things they did outside polling places was they simply handed out naturalization papers. They wanted voters, so they just made immigrants into citizens. And it's hard to imagine today how that happened, but the world was a much less organized place. All right, so the textbook can tell you more about these political machines. In this political cartoon, you can see the party boss is handing out immunity from arrest. They also controlled police departments, so they would bribe the police not to arrest people. They'd bribe judges to let people off, all kinds of corruption. In terms of national politics, the textbook talks about tariffs and the importance of monetary policy, including the gold policy, and the differences on the national level between the Democrats and the Republicans. And it also talks in detail about farmers and how farmers they were feeling kind of squeezed out as more and more people are moving to the cities, as the economy is transitioning into an industrial one and no longer an agricultural one. They were feeling squeezed out and unrepresented by the political system. So the textbook talks about the populists as an emerging third party that was representing the farmers. So in this drawing here, the artist has the farmer in the middle and he says, I feed you all. And the message is that none of these other men could do their work if the farmer wasn't out there growing food. So if you start at the top right, the military man and the preacher, the merchant, the businessman, the banker, the teacher, the railroad magnate, the politicians, none of them could do their jobs without the farmers. All right, so the Gilded Age is a really exciting time in American history, and I hope you enjoy the chapter.